What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Just don't make a scene, my mother warned me, her voice clipped and tight like she was already bracing herself for the embarrassment she assumed I'd become. I promised I wouldn't. And I honestly meant it at the time, standing there in my kitchen with the envelope still unopened in one hand and the receiver warm in the other. Her voice had come through the line with all the tenderness of a cold slap, a tone I knew too well, the one that told me this wasn't a request, it was a warning. She'd called me by my full name, Amanda Lee Carter, like she used to when I was little and tracking mud through the house. But this time I hadn't done anything wrong. I had just existed. That was enough for her to flinch. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, postmarked from some cutesy wedding website, the kind with floral edges and fake gold lettering, like it was trying too hard to look like money. It was heavy, thick cardstock, monogrammed, with that nauseatingly curated aesthetic people use when they're trying to prove they've moved up in the world. My sister's name was printed in cursive on the front, Jessica Carter to wed Bryce Langford, followed by a date I hadn't expected to see filled. She'd actually gone through with it. She was getting married. To someone else. I hadn't spoken to Jessica in 6 years. 6 long, wide, hollow years that stretched between us like a field of landmines, each one loaded with the kind of memories no one wants to revisit but can't quite forget. The last time we saw each other, I was wearing desert camouflage, dog-tired from deployment, and still raw from the kind of heartbreak that leaves bruises inside your chest. I'd come home to surprise Ryan, my fiancé at the time, if you can believe that, only to find him in my apartment, shirtless, his voice echoing from the bathroom where he was singing. And Jessica, my baby sister, stepping out of my bedroom in my robe, smiling like she'd just won a damn prize. I can still hear my mother's voice when I called her in tears, stunned and broken, thinking surely she'd be on my side. "Sweetheart," she'd said slowly, like I was 5 again, "you've been gone for so long. What did you expect him to do, wait around forever?" It wasn't the cheating, believe it or not. It wasn't even that it was Jessica. It was the fact that they had made a choice together, and my mother made one too. Not a single person from my family showed up when I finally packed up and left that town. Not one call, not one message, not even a Christmas card. I was supposed to disappear. And I did. I let myself be erased, because it was easier than clawing my way back into a life that clearly didn't want me in it. But now they were inviting me to a wedding. I don't know what stunned me more, the audacity of sending the invitation, or the fact that I didn't immediately burn it. I just stared at it, reading and rereading the names, the date, the venue, some vineyard estate with a view of the hills, of course, and that ridiculous line at the bottom, "Family is the root from which love grows." That was rich. I kept the card on the counter for 2 days untouched. I'd walk past it every morning with my coffee, every night with a glass of wine. I kept expecting to feel something: rage, disgust, maybe even longing. But all I felt was the slow rising heat of clarity. I wasn't invited because I was loved. I was invited because I was convenient. Because having the other daughter show up in a uniform would make for good optics. Because, on some level, Jessica still wanted to prove something to me. That her life turned out better. That she won. I wasn't interested in winning anymore. I'd done all that already, but not in the ways they measured. I'd survived. I'd rebuilt. I didn't marry. I didn't have kids. But I had peace, purpose, and silence, 3 things my family never gave me. I told my mother I'd come. And I meant that too. But I didn't tell her how I'd come. The night before I left, I opened my closet and pulled out my old Air Force dress blues, still covered in a plastic garment bag, untouched since the retirement ceremony. They still fit, perfectly. There was something powerful about the weight of them on my shoulders again, the metals glinting slightly under my bedroom light. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I recognized, not the girl who had cried on a bathroom floor while her world imploded, but the woman who learned how to stitch her own skin back together without waiting for an apology. I booked the hotel under my old call sign, packed light, and left early the next morning. The drive was long and empty, cutting through stretches of forgotten towns and gas stations with flickering lights. I let the road quiet my mind. I thought about Ryan, where he was, if he even knew she'd moved on. I thought about how silence can be a kind of revenge too, the kind that echoes louder than screaming ever could. But mostly, I thought about Jessica, and how pale her face was going to look when I walked into her perfect reception in full blues, with polished shoes, a pressed jacket, and a story she thought had been buried 6 years ago. I had no intention of making a scene, but I had every intention of being seen. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the reception hall wasn't the extravagant chandelier, or the meticulously arranged tables dressed in white and blush linens, or even the wall of roses behind the head table that looked like something pulled straight off a bridal Pinterest board. No, what hit me first was the silence, the thick, suspended moment where everyone turned their heads, some slowly, some with a jolt, and saw me standing there in my dress blues, straight-backed and steady, with my hair pulled into a low, military bun and my medals shining under the soft amber light like quiet, unspoken stories. It was the kind of silence that happens right before something tips over, the kind that trembles with tension even if no one can quite explain why, and for just a second, I thought maybe I'd misjudged the whole thing, maybe I wasn't supposed to come at all. But then someone near the back, an older man in a tan suit with an American Legion pin on his lapel, stood up with a hand over his heart and started to clap, slow at first, almost hesitant, until someone else joined him, and then another. And before I knew it, I was being applauded like I had just walked off the tarmac after some heroic tour. But I hadn't come back from a war, not this time. I had come back to settle something much more personal, something still festering under years of silence and denial. The applause died as quickly as it had risen, replaced by awkward smiles and a few murmurs, but it was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room, just a degree, just enough to make Jessica's jaw tighten as I met her eyes across the room. She was standing near the cake, a perfect tower of sugar and fondant that looked too beautiful to eat and too expensive to be sincere, and her face, pale, tense, blank in a way that only people trained in controlling their expressions understand, told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't expected me to show up, at least not like this, and definitely not to be the one commanding the attention in a room she'd spent a year making about herself. Jessica looked stunning, objectively. She always did, with her soft features and that practiced kind of femininity that seemed to come naturally to her, the kind of beauty our mother had always praised and compared me against. Like it was some moral high ground I had failed to reach, but I wasn't looking at her dress or her hair. I was watching her eyes, because eyes don't lie, and hers were screaming. I saw a flicker of something else, too, panic, maybe even regret, but it was buried fast, pushed down behind the practiced smile she offered the crowd as she stepped toward me, arms outstretched in a gesture that didn't match her expression. "Amanda," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard but low enough to stay sweet, "you made it." And I smiled, wide and sharp, because of course I made it. I was invited, wasn't I? That's what I said out loud, too, keeping my tone pleasant, almost cheery, while her grip on my arm tightened slightly. I could feel her nails through the fabric. She pulled me aside with the kind of urgency that looks polite from a distance, but feels like a threat up close. Her smile never dropped, but her words came out fast and tight through her teeth. "What are you doing? What are you trying to prove?" I didn't answer. I just looked past her, at our mother, Diane, who was pretending to be busy adjusting flower arrangements, though I could see her watching us out of the corner of her eye like a hawk that sensed trouble on the wind. "I told Mom I wouldn't make a scene," I said finally, and I meant it. "I'm here because you invited me. Don't act surprised I came." Jessica scoffed, tried to laugh it off, but the edge in her voice was razor-thin. "We thought you'd show up like a normal person," she hissed, "not like you were coming to collect a damn medal." I leaned in, my face still composed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't come to collect anything. I came to return something you left behind." And I let her sit with that for a moment, watching the confusion ripple through her carefully curated calm. The rest of the evening played out like a strange dream where everything looked exactly how it should, but none of it felt quite real. The laughter sounded rehearsed, the clinking glasses too coordinated, and the toasts filled with the kind of generic praise you find in wedding blogs, like someone had printed the script straight from Google and handed it out to the guests. And then there was the groom, Bryce, tall, clean-cut, utterly oblivious in the way men often are when they think their fiancé has no past worth questioning. He was polite when he met me, even seemed genuinely glad I'd come, which made me feel something I hadn't expected. Guilt, brief and cold, like a gust of wind through a cracked window. He didn't know. Of course he didn't. But he would. Soon. I made my rounds quietly, shaking hands, smiling at relatives who barely remembered me, offering nods to old friends of the family who weren't sure whether they should ask what I'd been up to or just avoid the subject entirely. No one mentioned Ryan. Not once. It was like he had been erased, scrubbed from the narrative, like the whole ugly mess of 6 years ago had never happened. But I hadn't forgotten, and neither had Jessica. I could see it in the way her eyes kept darting toward me during the speeches, like she was waiting for the boom to fall, unsure of when or how it would hit. Eventually, I made my way to the DJ booth, tucked near the back, behind a drape and a string of lights. The guy was young, early 20s maybe, the kind who looked like he was used to bored bridesmaids and drunk uncles requesting bad country songs. I handed him a small USB, labeled in black Sharpie with one word, memories. He raised an eyebrow. Play it during the cake cutting, I said simply, and don't stop it once it starts. He looked skeptical but nodded. Cash helps with that sort of thing, and I'd come prepared. As I walked away, I felt the USB's absence like a weight lifted. It had been sitting in my desk drawer for 2 weeks, ever since I'd found it tucked inside an old box of my dad's things, the box Mom had mailed me without ceremony when she cleaned out the garage. I hadn't expected much from it. Maybe some pictures, a few scanned documents, but what I'd found instead was something I wasn't supposed to see, a home video. One that had been filmed without the participants knowing. One that showed Jessica and Ryan in my old apartment, kissing in my kitchen, laughing in my bed, and most damning of all, being casually interrupted by Diane, who walked in with groceries and said, in the clearest voice possible, "Just make sure you're gone before Amanda comes home. I don't want to deal with the drama." It was dated 1 week before I got the emergency call to come home. As I stood by the bar, watching Jessica pose for photos with her bridesmaids, all tulle and teeth and calculated joy, I knew the cake would be served soon. And with it, the truth not screamed, not thrown, not splattered in public outrage, but delivered silently on a silver screen, in front of everyone who had been told a very different version of who I was and why I'd disappeared. And for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own family story. I felt like the author. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles in your chest when you're standing in the middle of a storm that no one else has noticed yet, a kind of eerie calm that doesn't come from peace, but from certainty, because you know that everything around you, the laughter, the music, the polite clinking of champagne glasses, and the way people toss their heads back when they laugh at something that isn't all that funny, is balanced on a fault line, and you're the only one who knows the earth is about to split open. I stood at the edge of the dance floor with a flute of champagne that I hadn't taken a single sip from, staring past the fairy lights and floral centerpieces, my eyes fixed on the carefully arranged illusion that Jessica had curated with such precision it almost felt sterile, like nothing had been left to chance, and yet, somehow, she'd still invited me. Whether she had done so out of arrogance, guilt, or some desperate attempt to show the world that she had evolved beyond what she'd done to me, I didn't know, and to be honest, I no longer cared. Because there was something cruelly satisfying about watching someone so desperate for control fidget through the hours knowing she no longer had any. She kept glancing at me, not constantly, not enough to draw attention, but just often enough that I could see the fear start to take root, spreading out in small, subtle ways, the way she adjusted her earrings again and again. How her smile tightened ever so slightly each time someone asked her about the guest in uniform, how she started to stand behind Bryce more often, like she was using him as a shield. It was just after dinner, while the band played some vintage Motown cover that didn't quite match the crowd's energy, that I took a moment to step outside, away from the buzz of forced conversation and carefully managed appearances. out into the cool air where the string lights flickered gently along the terrace and the world felt quieter, not peaceful, but quieter. I leaned against the stone railing and pulled the small flash drive from my purse, turning it over between my fingers like a coin you keep in your pocket for luck, even though it has no real value to anyone but you. I hadn't told a soul about the footage, not the friend who had driven me to the airport, not the therapist who once told me closure doesn't always look the way we expect, and certainly not the man who filmed it. The man behind the camera had been my father, though I hadn't known it at the time. I'd thought he was long out of the picture by then, retired, distracted, slowly becoming more stranger than parent, but apparently, in one of his rare visits home during those years, he had stopped by to check on the house while I was deployed. And what he captured on that camera, whether by accident or design, was not just betrayal, but the quiet, seething rot that had taken root in our family long before any of us had the language to name it. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Jessica and Ryan in my kitchen, acting like they belonged there, her barefoot and laughing while he poured wine into the glasses I'd bought from the base exchange 3 months before. The two of them tangled on the couch where I used to fall asleep after shifts, her head on his chest, his hands stroking her hair, and then, worst of all, our mother walking in through the door without a trace of surprise, setting the grocery bags on the counter and saying, in that same dry, dismissive tone she always used when she was pretending something didn't bother her, "You two need to be careful. If Amanda finds out, I don't want to hear about it." There was no shock, no outrage, no anger, just an offhand warning to avoid making her life inconvenient. That was what hurt most. Not that they had done it, but that it had been so easy for everyone around me to pretend it hadn't happened, to fold me out of the picture like a misprinted page in the family photo album. I tucked the flash drive back into my purse and returned inside just in time to hear someone tapping a spoon against a glass, calling the room's attention toward the head table where Jessica stood with her wine raised. Her toast, as expected, was a carefully crafted performance, warm enough to seem sincere, sprinkled with humor just edgy enough to get polite laughter, and centered entirely around the idea that family is about who shows up for you when it matters most. That line, in particular, hit me like a punch to the throat, not because it was untrue, but because it was true in the ugliest way possible. I watched her eyes as she delivered it, saw them dart toward me, then quickly away again. She knew. She didn't know what, but she knew something was coming. The lights dimmed slightly as the band took a break, and the soft, sweet tinkling of forks against dessert plates began as servers brought out slices of the massive wedding cake. It was all white chocolate and sugared flowers, a towering testament to everything Jessica thought love looked like. I waited until she had a fork in her hand, until the room had just begun to relax again, and then I saw the DJ glance toward me with a subtle nod before pressing a button on his laptop. At first, no one noticed what was happening. The screen behind the band flickered to life, and the first few seconds looked like a slideshow, old family pictures, soft piano music in the background. People murmured, smiling, thinking it was a surprise tribute. Jessica looked confused, then intrigued, probably assuming it was Bryce's doing. But then the footage changed. The grainy camera shook slightly as the timestamp appeared in the corner, the date unmistakably from 6 years ago. There was Ryan, pouring wine. There was Jessica, laughing barefoot. And then there was Diane, walking in with a grocery bag, saying exactly what I knew she had said. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted me earlier. This one was heavy, suffocating, thick with realization and shock. The kind of silence where people forget to breathe. Jessica didn't move. Bryce did. He stood up slowly, eyes glued to the screen, his face pale and slack. Someone near me gasped, and someone else muttered, "Jesus Christ." Chairs shifted. Glasses clinked as hands trembled. Diane stood, face frozen in horror, but it was too late. The truth was already out, and there was no muting it, no explaining it away. Jessica's fork dropped to the floor with a small, sharp clatter that seemed louder than the music ever had been. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She turned toward me, face flushed with 1,000 unsaid things: denial, shame, fury, maybe even sorrow, but I didn't give her the chance to speak. I stood calmly, brushed invisible lint from my jacket, and offered a slow, deliberate smile. All around us, the illusion unraveled. Guests whispered. Some looked away. A few stared at me with something like respect. And I just stood there, steady as I'd been taught to be, not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because I needed them to feel what I had felt for all those years. Alone. Powerless. Exposed. She had built her life on silence and secrets, but secrets rot when you bury them too long. And I had just brought everything back to the surface. There is a precise moment, fleeting and impossible to recreate, when the weight of a secret, once unburdened, hits a room like a slow, rolling thunder, not sudden, not explosive, but deep and far-reaching, echoing through the spaces between people and lingering in the air like a heavy perfume no one asked for. That moment, when the video ended and the room was forced to sit with the raw, unedited ugliness of what they had just seen, passed through the reception hall like a second-hand wave of nausea, slow but undeniable, tightening the air with something that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than the collapse of a lie too carefully constructed to survive the truth. People didn't move right away. They didn't speak, either, not loudly at least. It was a cascade of glances, of half-whispers and awkward coughs, of men adjusting their ties and women lowering their eyes, all performing the ancient social ritual of pretending not to be exactly where they were, seeing exactly what they saw. It was surreal in a way I hadn't anticipated, watching the polished facade of Jessica's perfect day melt in real time, not with fire or rage, but with the slow, agonizing drip of unraveling control. The cake stood untouched in the center of the room, a monument to the illusion, pristine and ridiculous, like a joke that no one wanted to explain. Jessica was still seated when the screen faded to black, her body stiff as if her bones were holding their breath, her eyes locked on some fixed point in the distance, unfocused, as if by refusing to look at anyone, she might somehow undo the damage. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat there, lips pressed so tightly together that the color drained from them, one hand still resting on the table beside a slice of cake she hadn't tasted, the other clenched under the fabric of her gown so hard I imagined she might draw blood. Bryce, meanwhile, stood just to her left, his face a map of disorientation, betrayal, and something I can only describe as dawning horror, not just at the video, but at the slow, shattering realization that the woman he had promised to spend his life with, the woman who had looked him in the eye only hours ago and vowed honesty and devotion, had built her future on the bones of a lie so intimate, so casually cruel, that the very foundation of their wedding vows had already crumbled beneath them before the ink had dried on the certificate. He looked at me. Not accusingly, not yet, but as if trying to measure how deep the wound went, how long I had known, and what exactly he had married into. I didn't look away. I held his gaze not with triumph, but with something quieter, heavier, the solemn understanding that revenge, when it finally arrives, doesn't taste like victory, it tastes like silence. And in that moment, no one said a word. It was Diane who moved first. Our mother, ever the curator of appearances, sprang from her chair like someone waking from a nightmare, her voice brittle as she called for the DJ to shut off the screen, though it was already black, and then turned to the crowd with that same exhausted smile she used to wear at PTA meetings when Jessica spilled juice on her dress, trying to recapture control that had long since slipped from her grasp. "There's been a mistake," she said, too quickly, her voice too loud for a room that didn't believe her anymore. "That video was old. Taken out of context." Amanda misunderstood. "Don't you dare," I said, louder than I meant to, but not loud enough to be a shout, just clear, final, the kind of voice that doesn't ask for permission because it knows it no longer needs it. "Don't insult them by pretending you didn't know. You were in the video." That was when the murmurs began to grow teeth. People started turning to one another, questions forming like smoke, rising fast. Is that really what happened? Wasn't Jessica engaged to someone else? Did Diane know? Who even is Ryan? And with every whispered doubt, every sideways glance, I felt the walls Jessica had built around her narrative begin to collapse, not with a crash, but with a sigh. A resignation that comes when everyone starts realizing the version they were sold was edited to fit the frame. Jessica stood slowly, her movements mechanical, her voice low and shaky, but laced with venom. "You think this makes you noble?" she asked, looking not just at me, but at the crowd, at the room, as if appealing to some unseen jury that might still see her as the wronged party. "You think bringing up the past at my wedding makes you brave?" I took a step closer, slowly, my heels clicking like a metronome on the polished floor, each step deliberate, my expression steady. "No," I said, "I don't think it makes me noble. But it does make me honest. And for what it's worth, that's more than you ever gave me." Bryce was still frozen, as if trying to process years in seconds, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked at the edges. "Is it true?" he asked, looking at Jessica, not with anger, but with something worse, heartbreak. Real, raw heartbreak. Was he her fiancé? Jessica said nothing. "Did you lie to me?" he asked again, but the question didn't need an answer. Silence, in moments like this, is louder than confession. Diane tried to intervene, placing a hand on Bryce's arm like a mother consoling a child, but he recoiled, as if her touch had burned him, and the message was clear. This wasn't her mess to fix. And for the first time, I saw her facade crack, not with tears or shouting, but with the dull, tired realization that the game had ended and there was no one left to manipulate. People began to leave. Not en masse, but in clusters, quiet and unsure, offering awkward goodbyes and avoiding eye contact, the way guests do at a party that suddenly became a crime scene. The music didn't come back on. The servers stopped pouring champagne. Someone knocked over a centerpiece and didn't bother to pick it up. The room wasn't angry. It was embarrassed for her, for the lie, maybe even for themselves for believing it so long. Jessica stood alone at the center of it all, her gown too bright, her smile too brittle, her entire posture one of someone trying to stay upright in the middle of a landslide. As I turned to leave, passing the head table with its now empty chairs and its cold slices of untouched cake, Jessica called after me, her voice hollow. "You think this makes you the good guy?" I paused in the doorway, the autumn air drifting in behind me like a final curtain call, and looked over my shoulder, meeting her eyes with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. "No," I said quietly, "but I'm not the one who wore my sister's ring." And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the wreckage not because I wanted to run from it, but because I had finally done what I came to do, not to destroy her day, but to take mine back. To reclaim the piece of myself they had buried so many years ago beneath guilt and shame and silence. And I didn't look back. The air outside was cooler than I expected, not biting or sharp the way late fall evenings sometimes get, but thick and still, like the sky itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether anything more would break before the night was over. The sky above the vineyard had darkened to that rich navy that barely skirts the edge of nightfall, and the golden string lights wrapped around the wooden beams of the patio flickered like the remnants of something once warm, now slowly flickering out. I stood just outside the hall, on the gravel path lined with decorative shrubs and manicured hedges, listening as the murmur of disoriented guests filtered through the walls like a fading radio station. There was no music, no laughter, no clinking of glasses anymore, just movement, low voices, and the occasional scrape of a chair being pushed back too fast. The party, such as it was, had bled dry. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't even feel angry anymore, which surprised me more than I wanted to admit, because for 6 long years, anger had been the only thing keeping the bones of that memory from snapping under the weight of silence. And now that it was over, now that the truth had been dragged out into the open and left there for everyone to gawk at like a car wreck in the middle of a wedding, all I felt was empty, not in a hollow, despairing way, but in the way a room feels after a crowd leaves. Quiet, echoing, uncertain. I leaned against the rough wooden beam of the overhang, the edges of my jacket catching the breeze, and for a moment, I let myself close my eyes and remember the version of me who used to believe that justice, when finally delivered, would feel like a cleansing fire. That once you got your moment, your revenge, your vindication, something inside you would finally heal. But the truth was messier than that. Justice didn't come with fanfare. It didn't arrive with a gold ribbon or applause. It came in a video played in a room full of white tablecloths and forced toasts, and it left behind a pile of ruined illusions that nobody really wanted to pick through. My revenge hadn't come with screaming or broken dishes. It had come dressed in silence and consequence, in 1,000 small shifts of perception that no one could unsee. Footsteps approached from the side, slow, heavy, deliberate, and I didn't have to turn to know who it was. He moved like a man carrying something he didn't ask for, the way soldiers walk after a mission they never wanted, and when he finally stopped beside me, he didn't speak for several seconds. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, his tux jacket wrinkled and the knot of his tie loosened like it had been tugged one too many times. "Hell of a way to drop a bomb, Lieutenant," he said at last, his voice low, touched with gravel, and just the faintest edge of something resembling amusement. I turned my head and saw that it was the older man from earlier, the one who had started the applause when I first walked in. The one with the American Legion pin who had likely seen enough in his lifetime to recognize the difference between ceremony and substance. I didn't answer right away. Just offered a small nod and looked back toward the reception hall where, even now, I could see Jessica through the tall windows, shoulders hunched, surrounded by people who looked like they weren't sure whether to comfort her or avoid her completely. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence, like the glossy image she had worked so hard to build had finally cracked, and now there was just this fragile, angry girl beneath it all who no longer knew how to be seen. "You did what you had to," the man beside me said, not unkindly. "Some truths don't leave room for etiquette." He paused, then added, "I don't imagine she expected you to actually show up, let alone walk in wearing the uniform." "She told me not to make a scene," I said, my voice calm, my eyes never leaving the glowing windows, so I didn't. The truth made it for me. He let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, and then gave me a look that was half admiration, half resignation. "You didn't ruin the wedding," he said. "She did that the moment she decided she could build something on someone else's pain and never have to answer for it." I didn't have anything to say to that. He was right, of course, but being right had never been the problem. The problem was that no one had ever cared before. When he left, I stayed there for a while, letting the night wrap around me like a coat I hadn't asked for. Eventually, Diane came out, her heels crunching against the gravel, and I knew by the rhythm of her steps that she was no longer trying to perform. When she stood before me, she looked 10 years older than she had that morning, not physically, but in the way shame bends the spine and hollows the voice. For once, she didn't have her arms crossed or her mouth set in that tight line of disappointment she always wore like armor. "You've ruined her life," she said quietly, not with rage, but with this flat kind of exhaustion that suggested she hadn't figured out who she was more disappointed in, me for saying what I said, or Jessica for confirming it. And maybe I should have apologized. Maybe there's a version of this story where I say something graceful and generous, where I remind her that we're all just human and hurt people, and blah blah blah, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Because for once, I wasn't going to cushion the truth to make it easier for them to swallow. "She ruined mine," I said. "You let her. And then you told me to be quiet about it." Her eyes shimmered then, just briefly, but she blinked it away like someone too proud to bleed in public. "You've changed," she said, almost like it was a bad thing, and I smiled, not warmly, but not coldly either. "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending." She didn't say anything else. Just nodded, turned, and walked away, and I knew that would be the last real conversation we'd ever have. Not because we were angry, but because the lie that once tethered us together had finally snapped, and without it, there was nothing left to keep holding the rope from both ends. I left shortly after that, not because I was driven out or dismissed, but because I had done what I came to do, and I didn't need to linger in the wreckage. There was nothing else to reclaim, no last word to deliver. Some stories end with a slam. Mine ended with a quiet door shutting behind me as I walked out into the night, my heels crunching softly against the path, the sound of my own breath steadier than it had been in years. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone or relive the footage in my head. I just drove. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty and honest. And for the first time, I wasn't running from something, I was simply leaving. But just as I turned onto the highway ramp, my phone buzzed against the console. One vibration, then another. A message from a number I didn't recognize. I picked it up, already expecting some distant cousin trying to check in or maybe even Bryce looking for more answers. But it wasn't. The message was short. Simple. It read, "There's more you don't know. Call me. Ryan." And, just like that, the air in the car thickened again. Because the one person I hadn't seen, hadn't heard from, hadn't even dared to wonder about, was still out there. And apparently, so was the rest of the story.